Hey everybody, this video is called Rape and Murder, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study in the book of 2 Samuel, where we're moving into the second half of the book here, where we're going to look at the rape of Tamar and the murder of Amnon. And so we're going to see a pretty crazy story today, and if you are a rape victim, feel free to cut off the video, if it's something that you have post-traumatic stress about, because this is a very touchy chapter today. But we're going to continue on with 2 Samuel 13 verses 1 and 2. And it says, "After this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin, and it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her." So Tamar, if you don't know the root words for Tamar, Tamar means actually palm tree. And Tamar was the daughter of David, and her mother was Maacah. And Amnon's love for her was lustful, as we're going to see in the following verses in the story. And unmarried daughters, they were kept in seclusion of men, so that none of them could see them alone. And Amnon, he had seen Tamar because they are a family relationship, and had conceived a violent passion for her, we see here in the text. And this was obviously forbidden by God in the Mosaic law in Leviticus chapter 18 verse 11. Yet with the example of Abraham in Genesis chapter 20 verse 2, and the common practice of among the surrounding nations where they were marrying their half-sisters. And so Amnon, he felt justified, and he wanted his passion to be fulfilled, not just with the thoughts, but he wanted to act on it to be fulfilled with Tamar. And I should have mentioned that Maacah was the daughter of King Tamar, king of Geshuros, that we saw back in chapter 3. And Amnon was David's firstborn son, who was through his wife Ahinoam. And he was technically first in line for the throne of Israel preceding David. He was a firstborn son, so he was very significant in the monarchy. And we see here that Amnon was lovesick for her, as Tamar was first off a virgin, and virgins were highly respected at this time period. They were available for marriage. People, they wanted a virgin when they got married. They didn't want today, where somebody has 20 different partners before they get, serious about relationships and all that. And verse 3 through 5 says, "But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother. Now Jonadab was a very crafty man, and he said to him, 'Why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner day after day? Will you not tell me?' Amnon said to him, 'I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister.' So Jonadab said to him, 'Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, "Please let my sister Tamar come and give me food, and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand." And so Jonadab was the son of David's brother Shemaiah, as seen back in 1 Samuel 16 verse 9, 1 Samuel 17 verse 3, and is also known as Shemaiah in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 13. And he was Ammon's cousin and counselor, who gave Amnon the plan by which he was able to rape Tamar. And as the upcoming verses are going to show us, Amnon lusted after Tamar, and he called it love, just like many today call sexual immorality love. And certainly that's not the last one to do this, to call lust love. And in his lust, Amnon did not allow himself to call Tamar his sister. You will not see in this story where he recognizes her as his sister. And he called her Absalom's sister, like it was going to depreciate or, or it was going to change the facts that they were still related. And the power of lust is strong enough to twist the way that we see reality. And Amnon is an example of that. And Jonadab, he advised Amnon to deceitfully arrange a private meeting with Tamar. And Jonadab and Amnon were united in their wicked thoughts, we see. In verse 6 through 10 says, Then Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, Please let Tamar my sister come and make a couple of cakes for me in my sight, that I may eat from her hand. And David sent home to Tamar, saying, Now go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was lying down. And she took flour and kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. And she took the pan and placed them out before him, but refused to eat. Then Amnon said, Have everyone go out from me. And they all went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, Bring the food into the bedroom, that I may eat from your hand. And Tamar took the cakes which she made and brought them to Amnon her brother in the bedroom. And so we see here that Amnon, he fakes an illness in order to be alone with Tamar. And it's a pretty crafty thing to do. In verse 11 through 14, Now when she had brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, Come lie with me, my sister. But she answered him, No, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. And where could I take my shame? And as for you, you would be like one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. However, he would not heed her voice, and being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. And so here we see that Amnon admits his incestuous desire as he made the request to Tamar. And Tamar appealed to Amnon with 4 reasons why he should not rape her. She is trying to get him to change the pathway he was on at this immediate moment. And first off, it was a deplored act in Israel that would violate the Mosaic law of God. And Tamar knew that such action would bring disharmony, and it would also bring bloodshed to the king's family, as well as a bad name for the family name. And second, as a fornicator, Tamar would be scorned as an object of reproach. And even though Tamar would resist this wicked crime taking place against her, perpetrated against her, Tamar would bear the stigma of one defiled. And third, Amnon would be regarded as a wicked fool and God-rejecting man without principles who offended ordinary standards of morality, therefore jeopardizing his right to the throne. And lastly, she appeals to Amnon to fulfill his physical desire for her through marriage, if it had to be that case. And she surely knew that such a marriage between half-siblings was wrong and sinful against the Mosaic law, but in desperation of the moment, Tamar was seeking a way to escape the immediate situation. In verse 14, forced means that he continued to move on and physically raped her. In verse 15 says, Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, Arise, be gone. And verse 15 is interesting to me, because after he rapes her, we see that he has a hate toward her. And when people today, when filth people today rape and make victims, they're not raping them because they're physically attracted. The majority of rapes that you will find today in psychology are going to be based off wanting to overpower somebody. They really don't love that person, and it's not even lust that draws them to do it. It's actually their own selfish pride seeking power over another person. And Ammon's love was nothing but physical desire that once glorified to be hatred. And his sudden disgust was a result of her unwilling resistance and the brutal act of what he did, and feelings of remorse and dread of exposure and punishment. And all of these rendered her intolerably undesirable to him. And while David was never this dominated by lust, he walked in a condition like with marriages, multiple marriages, and then his adultery at Bathsheba. And I know there's a critic in the last video, last Tuesday, I think it was, when I did on David and Bathsheba's adultery, he claimed that David raped Bathsheba. But I don't believe that's the case. I still hold to my convictions that it was adultery consensual. Because when there is a rape that takes place in the Bible, God does not water it down. God calls it out as it is through his word. And that's all I'm going to say on that, if that person's listening. In verse 16 through 18, it says, "So she said to him, 'No, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other that you did to me.' But he would not listen to her. Then he called his servant who attended him and said, 'Here, put this woman out, away from me, and bolt the door behind her.' Now she had on a robe of many colors, for the king's virgin daughters wore such apparel. And his servant put her out and bolted the door behind her." And so Amnon sent Tamar away, and we see that it was just as wrong as the rape itself was, because it would be unavoidable that she would be treated of the same guilty conduct that the seduction had come from her. And that is what happened, especially at this time period. Rape victims, they would be treated as the lowest of society. And sometimes we see that today, and I do agree that there are some that are, trying to tear other people's characters apart and then make up a rape that happened. But oftentimes today we still see that rape victims are not respected and that they're looked down upon, like if they were guilty themselves in being a victim. In a garment which identified the wearer's special position. In Tamar, the robe identified her as the virgin daughter of a king. In the tearing of the robe, it symbolized her loss of the special possession. In verse 19 and 20 says, "Then Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her robe of many colors that was on her, and laid her hand on her head, and went away crying bitterly. And Absalom, her brother, said to her, 'Has Amnon your brother been with you? But now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart.' So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house." And so the ashes were a sign of mourning in this time period. And the torn robe symbolized the ruin of her life. And to go back talking about rape and everything, you will find in the Mosaic law that the Mosaic law called for the death penalty against rapists that are convicted. And that is why, because you're literally destroying a life when you carry out that such act. And the hand on the head was symbolic of exile and banishment. And the crying showed that she viewed herself as good as dead. And that's what happened at this time period with rape victims. They were viewed as good as dead. They were the walking dead pretty much in respect of society. And Absalom told his sister not to pay the undue attention or worry about the consequences of the rape. And Absalom minimized the significance of what had taken place only for the moment, while he already began to plot taking vengeance into his own hands, getting revenge for using this crime as a reason to do what he wanted to do anyway and remove Amnon from the line of the succession to the throne. And Tamar remained unmarried and childless, we saw, and her full brother was her protector, and the children, polygamous, lived by themselves in different family units. In verse 21-22, it says, "But when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. And Absalom spoke to his brother Amnon, neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar." And so fury and resentment were David's reactions to the report of the rape that took place. And because he did not punish Amnon for his crime, King David is neglecting his responsibility, first off as the king who is supposed to bring justice, and then also as father. And the lack of justice in the land would come back to haunt David, as we're going to see in the upcoming chapters in a future day. And as Amnon hated Tamar, Absalom loathed his half-brother Amnon. In verse 23-27, "And it came to pass after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. So Absalom invited all the king's sons. Then Absalom came to the king and said, 'Kindly note, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant.' But the king said to Absalom, 'No, my son, let us not all go now, lest we be a burden to you.' Then he urged him, but he would not go, and he blessed him. Then Absalom said, 'If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us.' And the king said to him, 'Why should he go with you?' But Absalom urged him, so he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him." And so Baal Hazor was a Benjaminite village of Hazor, seen later on in the book of Nehemiah 11:33. It was located 11 miles northeast of Jerusalem, and it was the place for sheep shearing feast put on by Absalom, in which he would invite his family, his brothers and half-brothers, as well as King David and his royal court to it. And David, he declined, but he encouraged Absalom to still hold the feast for the king's sons as a means to unity and harmony. And with David's denial of the invitation, Absalom requested that Amnon go as his representative. And although David had reservations concerning Absalom's intent, he allowed all his sons to go. And 2 years would go by, but Absalom did not stop plotting the revenge of Amnon's sin against his sister Tamar. In verse 28-29, "Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, 'Watch now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not be afraid. Have I not commanded you, be courageous and valiant?' So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each one got his mule and fled. And so Absalom murdered Amnon through his servants, just as David had killed Uriah through others back in chapter 11, verse 14-17. And even though the rape was punishable by death, personal vengeance was also just as unacceptable to God. In due course of the law was to be carried out. And mules were ridden by the royal family in David's kingdom, as you also find in chapter 18, verse 9. And Absalom waited until Amnon was relaxed and vulnerable with a few cups of wine. And as David committed adultery, made Uriah drink, and then he murdered Uriah, so would happen to the incest Amnon. He's made drunk, and then we see he is murdered. In verse 30-36 says, "And it came to pass while they were on the way that the news came to David, saying, Absalom had killed the king's sons, all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. So the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the ground, and all his servants stood by with their clothes torn. Then Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, answered and said, Let not my lord suppose they have all killed all the young men, the king's sons, for only Amnon is dead. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Now therefore, let not my lord the king take the thing to heart, to think that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon only is dead. Then Absalom fled, and the young man who was keeping watch lifted his eyes and looked, and there many people were coming from the road on the hillside behind him. And Jonadab said to the king, Look, the king's sons are coming, as your servant said, so it is. So it was, as soon as he had finished speaking, that the king's sons indeed came, and they lifted up their voice and wept. Also the king and all his servants wept bitterly, very bitterly. And so verse 30 through 36, we see an exaggeration of all the king's sons were plunged, everyone in a grief, until it was corrected. And Jonadab knew that Absalom's plot to kill Amnon for the rape of Tamar, and death was prescribed through the law, as I mentioned already in Leviticus 18:11 and Leviticus 18:29, as cut off means to execute. And David reacted with mourning rather than unbelief. And we see that he grieved at learning of his eldest son's death. In verse 37 through 39 says, But Absalom fled and went to Tamar, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and there was there for 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon, because he was dead. And so Absalom, he fled, as the law regarding premeditated murder gave him no hope of returning under the city of refuge law, which we studied back in the book of Numbers 35, in February. And the cities of refuge would afford him no sanctuary. There was no safe space for him. So we see that he leaves his father's kingdom for Geshur, east of the Sea of Galilee, under the protection of the king, who was the grandfather of both Tamar and Absalom. And David gradually accepted the fact of Amnon's death, and he desired to see Absalom again, but he took no action to bring him back. And so now we see that David has a separation issue with his other son Absalom, because Absalom killed his eldest son. And so we looked at Amnon's desire of Tamar. We see that he's filled with lust. And we saw Jonadab's evil advice. And we saw that Amnon pretended illness in order to be alone with Tamar. And we see that David was pretty soft with his children overall, that we could say. And we witnessed that Amnon proceeded to rape Tamar, that he forced himself onto her. And we see that once Amnon fulfilled his lustful desire, he rejected Tamar. After that, he didn't want nothing to do with her. And we will often see children model their parents' sinful behavior, and they will go even further in their direction of sin than the parent pointed towards them. And we see that through David and his son Amnon. We saw that David had many concubines. He was polygamous, and he was adulterous with Bathsheba. Now we see his son go even further down the total depravity lane. And we saw Amnon toss Tamar out of his presence. We see that Tamar mourned, and Absalom, as a good brother, comforted her. And part of the blindness of lust leads the lustful man or woman to believe that his or her actions aren't obviously apparent to others. And Amnon, we can agree that he was blinded by lust. He was deceived by the blindness of lust. And we saw how David displayed anger in action. And we saw Absalom invited all the king's sons to the feast. And we saw that Absalom killed Amnon. And we learned that David learned of the murder of Amnon. And we see how it created a wall between him and his son Absalom. And then we see that Absalom, he fled to Geshur as the chapter ends. And I just want to keep the wrap up a little bit shorter because I've been going long with these last couple chapters. But we'll see you next as we're going to look at Absalom returning to Jerusalem. So Absalom won't stay in Geshur forever. He will return to Jerusalem, and we'll see you next time as we look at that chapter. God bless, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.